I know how much all of you just love rocking onto that Rural Roads theme song, but because we had a little delay at the beginning, I'm going to jump right in. We can always maybe play that for you at the end as we say our farewells. I'm Jen Walinga, and I'm a professor in the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads University, and welcome to our webinar series. This is the 11th episode in our series, and today we'll be talking with a number of fascinating guests, as usual, about cultural frameworks for both safe and high performance sport environments. How do we reconcile the two? I had a fabulous conversation with Alain Delorme. He's out at INS, the Institute for Sport in Quebec, and he is a strength and conditioning guru and leader. And he was struggling with the same thing, you know, especially when we've been brought up in an era where maybe we value performance over other things. How do we reconcile these two things? And we are obviously in a time of reconciliation of a number of concepts. So what a great thing to be wrestling with today. Great to see people active in the chat. I really look forward to seeing your questions. We always start at Royal Roads by acknowledging that we are indeed on the lands of the Lekwungen and Ikwasupsun people. These are our ceded territories, actually, and they are very gracious to allow us to be stewards of these lands. We rely heavily on the land that surrounds our campus of 300 hectares of old growth and new growth, and a beautiful lagoon out front. We have the Olympic Mountains in the distance, and a series of very interesting inherited buildings that we occupy and participate in, learning, teaching, and trying to really live the values of our university. So we're very grateful, and we're doing our best to both steward the lands, but also do our best to really understand how best to do things better, repair and restore and reconcile. But today we'll talk about that same kind of reconciliation between safety and health, well-being, social development, human development, and this desire to evolve and grow and perform. I also live and I'm working out of home for the past 2 years. I live on the same lands, but a little bit further away down in Cadbro Bay. And I spent a lot of time on this beautiful lake in near the Wasanish peoples, actually. This is the Royal Roads campus. And as you see, these eager learners venturing out into the wide world, and where a lot of our learning takes place on the actual campus and in amongst the ecology that surrounds us, the ecological systems. We draw on the lessons and principles that nature has to teach us constantly at our university. Our School of Communication and Culture uses this as our metaphor and image, a bridge. Communication can't really occur until we understand differences and embrace diversity. I find I have had a strong background in sport, a long background in sport, and continue to focus on sport as a sector. And this bridge is a beautiful metaphor for some of the challenges we encounter in sport as well. I mean, we are interdependent. We need our opponents. We are striving together, competing together. That's where the derivation of the word compete comes from. We also really believe at Royal Roads in acknowledging different kinds of learning. In fact, we expect you to show up and contribute learning from different areas of your life, your professional learning. And so we have a partnership with an organization called Game Plan, where we welcome in athletes and do the same kind of thing, where we acknowledge the learning that they have distilled from their experience representing Canada internationally and domestically, in a variety of different sports. It's wonderful to add them to our wonderful, our population, our community, our learning community here at Royal Roads. This webinar series is examining sport as a sector. And I find, you know, a number of our programs make room for conversations within multiple different sectors, environmental and health and educational, but sport is another one of those sectors that we are increasingly exploring as a university. And I'm definitely at the front of that. As a vanguard of the idea, I think sport offers us lots of opportunities to reflect on leadership and the qualities and factors that contribute to powerful, positive social change kinds of leadership models. As you look around the sport environment, we see a number of different initiatives and organizations and processes and structures in place that are examining similar kinds of themes that Royal Roads focuses on, like development and diversity and inclusion, education, environment, equity, human rights, health, media, communication, peace, and conflict. And our programs reflect these core themes, and I see all of these themes being wrestled with across the sport environment as well. Sport has power. We can learn within it as a sector, but sport itself, just like any sector, has the opportunity to teach us core principles that can help lead and navigate through times of change and unrest and opportunity. So in this episode, we're going to be exploring what cultural frameworks can support a safe and a high-performance sport environment. So these two concepts aren't in conflict. They are actually mutually beneficial. And how do we reconcile the two concepts? I operate out of the School of Communication and Culture. Culture, the reason we have those is inextricably linked, is that culture really is values, principles, priorities communicated. So you feel the integrity of your culture within your organization, community, society, based on the integrity is measured based on the alignment or integration of what we say we value and prioritize and what we actually do, invest in, prioritize, support, right? So we're seeing a lot of this incongruity, contradiction, hypocrisy within sport currently, and people wrestling with, well, how do we bring them back into alignment? We're good people. We want to do good for those who are participating in sports. So how do we do that? I want to give a brief introduction to our guests today. We've invited John Donnelly, and I'm so excited. This is my first time to really meet John. We've had a little chat beforehand, but this will be a real opportunity to get to know each other, and I hope that we continue this relationship. John Donnelly is currently the director or head of sport integrity at UK Sport. I love the word integrity, and it's great to see it utilized by UK Sport. And John works with a colleague of mine, Catherine Granger, who rode for the UK as well. So that was where the connections were coming. And I find sport a fascinating community in terms of those connections and relationships. He has been an award-winning, I don't know if you call it that actually, a military leader in the Army. He also led these programs around elite sports, but also adaptive sports for injured soldiers. He is currently the head of sport integrity, but that covers a variety of topics. And I just don't know how you do it actually, John. You know, we explore conduct, but also the anti-doping and also safeguarding. And we have separate organizations that address each of those under an umbrella, of course, but while you are really leading the charge in a lot of areas. He also is involved in a mental health steering group and the Athlete Transition Project. And I mentioned Game Plan earlier, and that's similar in Canada, where we're looking at how do we help athletes transition into post-sport worlds. It doesn't always have to be non-sport worlds and careers, but it can be a transition leaving sports. How do we support them? And I think in that topic too, we try to think about how do we leverage our athletes? You know, these are amazing individuals who've had an education in sport across the world and have represented Canada and participated in elite level sport and learned so much about high performance and leadership. So how do we better leverage these people as they reintegrate or have a re-entry phase of their life back into the other non-sport world? He's also an avid cyclist, and I encourage you to look up John. His bio online is really fun. It gives me a sense of who he is as an individual. And we'll start with John, ask him lots of questions, but I also want to introduce some panelists that we have invited in who have been or are either working for Royal Roads as research assistants, or they're taking their graduate studies at Royal Roads, or are planning on pursuing some graduate studies in a variety of topics. So I introduce you to Samantha Heron, who has a rowing background as well, and she's currently coaching in the para realm with Rowing Canada. She's an MA candidate in the program Conflict Analysis and Management at RRU, and her thesis topic addresses the conflict experience that coaches and sport administrators are having in the parasport system. And by that, it's kind of a cultural conflict that we're experiencing. So paras, we've done webinars on para, and I think it's a wonderful environment to explore these concepts and reflect on them. We have Andrea Burke, love this photo of Andrea, looking fierce, has played rugby for Canada for many years, and on the 15s team, World Cup silver medalist in 2014, loved watching that whole tournament. And has been a board chair with BC Rugby, color commentator, among other things. She's a fantastic speaker and facilitator and has leveraged her MA leadership She's now looking at doctoral work in the area of factors contributing to the decline in mental and physical health among elite athletes. And she works with me on a couple of projects as well, where we're looking at the Canadian sports system and really examining this question of cultural frameworks. Natasha Watcham-Roy has also competed in rugby for Canada, but in the sevens team, and has lots of medals to her name as well. A great career in sport, a huge advocate for mental health, and is a master's candidate in leadership currently at Royal Roads, with her thesis topic almost complete, actually, just rocking along in her process of creating psychologically safe environments among the Canada Rugby Sevens Women's Program, and lots of great data that she's navigating. I want to encourage our participants to please post their questions in the chat throughout the webinar. We will monitor the chat. We are multitaskers here at Royal Roads. And I know there were lots of people who weren't able to attend. That always happens. We always get about 150 signing up, and then we send out that recording. And please share the recording. I know there will be some fantastic nuggets today from these brilliant individuals. So we're looking forward to seeing some questions that you have. I was lucky enough to listen to Bev Priestman, the coach of our women's soccer team from the Tokyo Olympics last night as part of a conference. And it was just great to see all the wonderful questions people ask. So even if we don't have time to get to them, asking them is crucial, because we'll see them in the chat and that will get people thinking in different ways. And of course, we all communicate afterward, and we'll be communicating hopefully with you as participants as well after the webinar. So please feel free all the way through the webinar. And we'll also try to leave a bit of time for that broader discussion, people to come in with their mics on. I want to encourage my panelists, when you have something you'd like to say, just turn your mic on. It's a nice little signal for me that I know you've got something bursting to say on a topic, and that way I can kind of facilitate it a little bit better. And I'm going to just stop the share now. And if you want to click on view, you can see, have a speaker view that helps you see the panelists a little more in a greater focus, because we've got quite a good grid of participants, but it's also really fun. I like having that grid view, because then you see all the wonderful people that are here. And feel free to turn your camera on as well. It's nice to see the faces and the real people behind the cameras. Wonderful to see some great friends out there in the audience. Love it. So let's start with you, John. And my first question for you is more general and really an opportunity to you to burgeon out your introduction. Tell us a little bit more about the roles that you play in your role with UK Sport, and some of the key, perhaps, initiatives or your foci, the things that you're really focusing on in your role currently. And John's having a little trouble with camera, so we won't be able to see his smiling face, but I did post that wonderful picture of him, so you get a sense of who he is. Go ahead.
Yeah,
John.
and I can say I still look as good as doing that picture, even though I was taking the Tour de France 4 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I have to say, having been to British Columbia, I wish I was over there with you rather than in a rather damp Dorset. So I joined UK Sport about 4.5 years ago. I retired from the Army, which is another high-performing team. And there's a certain irony about going to work in sport, because, of course, sport was basically invented to stop people fighting each other. And the one thing that struck me immediately, because I did work with some pretty exceptional people in the Army, is that sport, or certainly high-performance sport, it's not for normal people. The athletes and coaches that work in high-performance people are truly exceptional. They put themselves through things a day on day, month on month, that most people just wouldn't. And I'm quite pleased that when I get my annual appraisal at the start of the year, I get half a dozen objectives, and no one keeps ratcheting them up week on week. And of course, the other thing, and it's obvious, isn't it? Sport is a highly contested space, and judgments are the stuff of thousandths of seconds. So I certainly found it. I mean, I didn't come in thinking that it was going to be easy, but I was certainly quite struck about some of the challenges. I came in post Rio. I think UK Sport was going through, or the UK high performance system was going through a difficult patch. It was about 20 years old, but actually, because we work in 4-year cycles, actually it was 4 to 5 years old. It wasn't that mature. and undoubtedly there'd been a huge emphasis about putting in place a system that was truly world class around systemizing the approach to athletes, putting the right support around them, putting the right facilities around them, doing the right talent identification, etc. That was all great, but I don't think we'd really thought about some of the consequences in terms of sustainability. And although there was never a suggestion the athlete wasn't at the heart of it, I think it was clear that some people had lost sight of that a bit. That, you know, that contested space had driven some unfortunate behaviours, and we had a mantra that described our investment approach, which was no compromise. And what we meant by that was we didn't compromise on anything that was needed to get the athlete into the right place. But that was, if you like, transposed by the media as our approach to life, and that there was no compromise to success, and athlete welfare just didn't matter, and that was wrong. And so I came in to try and address that. We recognized that we need to make sure the system is more sustainable for two reasons. One, to make absolutely clear to athletes that they remain the heart of the system, but secondly, if you get a healthy system, has to recruit people. You have to get people to want to come forward, to pull on their runners and thrash themselves around the circuit, or get in a boat and row up and down, you know, whatever it is. You've got to get people coming forward. And so I looked at a number of areas. First of all, just stuff around conduct. There was no articulation of the difference between hard, demanding training and bullying, and therefore there was no guidance to coaches about how you push athletes both physically and psychologically, because that's what you have to do if you're working at the edge of human performance. It's not going to be a nice place to be all the time, and any training session that's within limits is not going to achieve that. But nonetheless, there are ways you do it, and actually in many cases sometimes training session was about restraining athletes, not just encouraging. But critically, there wasn't good guidance about how you periodize that in terms of within the training environment, and making sure that it doesn't leach over out with the training environment. So we put quite a lot of guidance around that, and education, because it's no good just telling people why they shouldn't do things, why they shouldn't treat people badly. Actually, what we wanted to do was explain why it was a bad idea and what good looked like. Another one of the projects that I got quite heavily involved with was improving the offer of our the British Athletes Commission, which is the association for all our athletes, Olympic and Paralympics. Hitherto, it was basically run by one individual and their dog, and getting around 1,400 odd athletes spread all over the UK. I know the UK is quite small in the context of Canada, but it's still quite big. So one individual getting around supporting athletes was a challenge, and they tended to get involved supporting athletes in disputes when it was all getting pretty gritty. Mm-hmm. And therefore it was, and at the adversarial stage, what I wanted was them to have more capability, so they could intervene early. They could deal with problems upstream. They could actually act as a critical friend to both athletes and programs. So where they saw something that wasn't working as well as it should, they can actually engage and try and get behaviors, get regimes, etc. Turned around. And so it's gone from a organization with a budget of around about £500,000. It's now got a budget of around about £2 million, and it now employs 8 people, whereas it used to employ 1. And that was fundamental. And it's there not just to provide independent advice and guidance to athletes who are in dispute with their NGBs. It's also there to provide collective voice, sort of representation. So when we're developing policy, and a good example would be recently the policy we developed around pregnancy, we can use the BAC to help us with that. two other points I'll talk about. Mental health strategy. When I turned up, there wasn't much in the mental health space, and I'd previously introduced the mental health strategy to the Army. So we put in place a pretty comprehensive mental health strategy based around education, provision, training and assurance, to make sure that everybody, whatever level they operate within the high performance system, have a level of education and awareness around mental health. So I mean, the mental health first aider, and then deeper levels of understanding, particularly amongst practitioners, often psychologists and physios. Physios are often informal psychs, and there's often a link with people going to seek physio treatment, actually will unburden themselves in different areas or on different issues. So we put a lot of work in there to guide the practitioners to identify athletes that might be struggling with an issue and point them to get the right help that they need. And we've also included an expert panel of clinical psychiatrists and psychologists that actually have an understanding in sports and exercise medicine. And we sort of call it the hamstring test. If you turn up for training and your hamstring's tight, no one can see it, but you can feel it. Well, you're going to tell the coach that. You're going to say to the coach, my hamstring's tight. I think we need to change what I do today because I don't want to tear it. Well, actually, the same approach works with mental health. No one can see it, but the athlete can feel it, or indeed the coach, because it's not just exclusively about athletes, and giving them the courage to talk about it and to seek help and guidance, and it's not seen as a sign of weakness. And I was quite encouraged. I mean, I don't know how much you caught because it would have been on the UK media, but there was a lot of discussion. I mean, I know there was a Simone Biles, so I'll put that to one side because she's not one of ours, but a lot of our athletes, when they're being interviewed at the end of their competition, whether they'd done well or hadn't done well, that there was a lot of discussion about mental health, and there was clearly it was probably a bit like a casualty ward, after a Saturday night. There was quite a lot of emotion and blood all over the place, but within 48 hours it was all cleaned up and people were ready to go. And I think athletes feeling empowered to talk about how they were feeling quite openly and quite publicly was a way that they were able to deal with the pressures and strains of what was a very different games, because of the lack of familial support, etc. So we've taken that as a real bonus, and now every sport has its own mental health plans, which includes, as I say, the education, the provision, how to support athletes if they're at competitions and they start having problems in a range of issues. And then the last thing that I've been involved in is, we call it the Athlete Support Project. It's making sure that everything that we do with our athletes, from induction, support on program, transition, and the next phase of their lives, is all joined up and it's coherent. And so transition isn't something you talk about when you've been deselected or you've decided time's up, or it's sort of the last 6 weeks of your time on a program, or when you've torn your hamstring for the 18th time and it's game over. It's something you start a conversation about when you go onto a program. And as part of our athlete development programs, we now require them each year. Not only do they have performance goals, they have personal and professional development goals where they must do some sort of activity, course, education, something that actually moves their personal development along, so that we want their time on our world-class program to be a development and life enriching experience that's not just about what they hang around their neck, it's what they've learned along the way. Because at the end of the day, being a really good rower doesn't fit you for a job when you're no longer rowing, unless you happen to want to be a rowing coach, and that doesn't work for everybody. So we're encouraging them to take on a range of skills, and that's good. And linked to that, going back to, I spoke earlier about the British Athletes Commission, they are now looking to create an alumni organisation so that those athletes have that sense of community when they step away from the programs. It's there if they want it. It might be something that they return to after a break. It might be something they go straight into. It might be something that they never bother with. But the point is, it's there for them to help. So I think I'll probably stop at that stage, because I've probably spoken for quite long enough, and other people have got bits that I'm sure they want to add.
Yes, thank you very much, and such a good overview. And of course, this ties into, I sent the panelists a bunch of questions, but I can see how you've kind of kicked off on a number of these topics, which is great. So I'll just keep bringing us back to some of those. The first thing you talked about, actually the last thing, I'll start with that because that's fresh in our minds, about COVID and post games, and how that COVID seemed to really showcase or highlight or promote the need for mental health support for athletes. And you talked about the work you're doing within UK Sport around mental health support. You also mentioned, education earlier when you're talking about the importance of safeguarding and the need for education. What kind of education are you offering? And I see one of the participants, Paula McQuaid, this is an interest of hers for her research. What kind of education are you putting in place to support athletes, like you say, with a number of things to meet them earlier down the track? So before they have that hamstring tear or it snaps, as Andrea said in the chat there, how do we skill them up, so that they're not experiencing or know how to seek support earlier before it becomes an actual issue? What's going on in UK sport?
So one of the areas that I think is poorly done, and I would say that this is not unique to UK sport, I think it's poorly done in a range of organisations, is induction, and we're all guilty of that. You turn up at day one in a new job and they say, okay, right, you're not going to start work straight away, they're going to spend the morning on induction, and you can see everyone's heads go down and go, no, I don't need this. I'm 24 years of age, I'm going to change the world, I really don't need to know all that sort of stuff. But actually it's really, really important. And so we know that we need to up our game on induction, so that when people come onto a program from a pathway, there's a very clear delineation, and we're probably looking at around about a 2-day induction, and then that induction needs to be refreshed annually, because people forget about it. So we can talk about codes of conduct, how we treat each other, how you can make a complaint, because actually that's really important. Talk about why transition matters. Talk about how the selection processes work, what's people's lines of appeal. Actually, quite often disputes fester and grow because people don't understand what to do. And when they finally are sort of spurred into action, by that stage, there's quite a lot of emotion and anger in the issue. Now, I'm not stupid. Sport is highly contested, and if a decision goes against you, people don't like that, and they will contest it, and then they'll find reasons to try and justify their position. And although we have employed mediation and use it successfully in some cases, there are plenty of cases where it's just not going to work, because you've got to get both parties' consent to it. So we recognize that we can improve, but we can't make it perfect because of the nature of the individuals. Another area that we've done quite a lot of work on before COVID struck, and it's something that we will return to once it's over, is this whole issue of grooming and coercion and controlling relationships. Really, really difficult. And there's the UK police services, that's another area that are having problems with this, because it is quite easy for people who have that particular disposition to take advantage of circumstances. That's a really great coach. Look at the extra time he's spending coaching that athlete. Isn't that fantastic? And she comes from a disadvantaged family background where she doesn't get the support. So he's taking her home. All those things that could look really good can also have a somewhat nefarious process. So how do you educate people to what the warning signs might be? How do you educate people to be supportive and caring of their athletes, but not stepping over those lines? How do we train our coaches to be compassionate and have a sense of humanity, but not step over those lines? when you have a male coach working with a female athlete, and she is in a competition and has a pretty bad result that was unexpected, sometimes that athlete wants a sense of comfort and humanity. How can you do that without crossing the line? All these sorts of things that people need to think about, because it's really difficult and it's really challenging. And an awful lot of our coaches, you know, they're former athletes. They don't get any what I'd call formalized training. They pick up skills along the way, and they pick up coaching qualifications. But I often think that the sort of the softer coaching skills, the human coaching skills, don't always get covered. They'll teach them how to put an oar in the water at the perfect angle, and how to take the catch and finish the stroke and all that. And you know, the coaches can cite that in their sleep. But how do we assist them with the softer skills? How do we? One area we were working on is giving coaches guidance on communicating the results of selections. How do you do it in a way that's as human as possible? Because the moment you give, so the athlete sits down with the coach, the moment that coach says to the athlete, "I'm really sorry, but you're not in the boat, you're not in the team, you're not on the bike," whatever, they stop listening. They're not hearing what the coach is saying. Their brain is catastrophizing. They're starting to think, what am I going to tell so and so? Why? It's not fair. They're not listening. So we've been working with coaches to suggest ways that they can break that news with a third party present. That means that athlete can be supported afterwards, and they have a chance to internalize and understand those decisions with a degree of privacy. We also say now, before you announce the team, deal with the near misses. Deal with the people first who think that they probably should have been in the team and nearly were in the team but weren't in the team. They're the individuals that you need to really focus your effort on, and they need to be the highest priority, because the people that are in the team, you haven't got to worry about them. They're on cloud nine, and there'll be another group of people that knew that they weren't going to be in the team for a month of Sundays, so they're being realistic anyway. So it's that middle third. And again, none of our coaching courses really give coaches the skills to do that. How do you let someone down gently? Don't lead someone along when actually they don't stand a chance of being in the boat, on the bike, in the team. Think about how you manage that. So I think those are some of the areas that we've been working on.
Really appreciate those insights. And what I'm really appreciating as well is the different language, right? That's why I think talking and sharing with people in other countries, because we all use different terms, different language, and that calls upon us to reconsider what we call it. And I'm seeing some parallels in our country. You know, we have an athletes can, we have athletes commissions, but I'm not sure where we have the alumni portion maybe, or that we're leveraging it to that degree. I think some NSOs, you call them NSBs, that are recognizing the purpose and value of their athlete representatives, their athlete directors, their athlete councils, and the role they can play in this third party kind of environment where we're trying to provide balance the power, frankly, right? So if they have a support there when they're having a selection information announced to them, yeah, that balances the power. And it also holds the coach and whoever else is sharing, technical director or whatever, the information or the results of the selection with them, holds them to account, so that, you know, it abides by the rule of two that we have in our safe sport. We've got some questions around that too, around the independence. And that for me just comes back to power balance. But I also want to open up the conversation so that we have a few other people on our panel contributing. And Samantha Heron, I can see, is chomping at the bit. So I'd like to invite her in to talk a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, when I was listening to John talk about skills that coaches need to have, I think one of the preventative pieces we need to do is actually be very explicit about the skills we are hiring for, and ensure that those persons have the right development. And when we look at where sport is going, we have so much expertise on the technical aspects of the sport, but those pieces in terms of person management and understanding mental health and doing the conflict skills, we need to be very explicit in our hiring practices, in our systems development, to ensure that those are the right people in the positions who know how to leverage expertise. And that's very different from what I think our coach education and our job development currently looks like. I'm curious what others think on that one.
Mhm. And John, we'd love to hear more about your system. I think this has really been so valuable. What do you do what have you been doing to educate those coaches in these areas?
Well, sadly, not that much over the last 18 months. But we do have we do have a range of elite courses that UK Sport sponsors, where we take the brightest and the best of our coaches, and we educate them in the best practice. And actually, we mix and match. So they're not just Olympic coaches. We will have rugby coaches, football coaches, cricket, etc. So we do try and spread, or not just spread, but learn best practice from across the sporting landscape. And so, to give an example, our elite coach course, which graduated last year, included one Gareth Southgate, who's manager or head coach of the England football team. So he was there working alongside some of our best and brightest Olympic and Paralympic coaches, and they're all sharing ideas. Samantha, I think you make a really good point, and I don't think if I'm really critical, I don't think NGB spend enough time developing their coaches in some of these areas. So if you all imagine a 4-box grid, so you've got values up the vertical scale, and you've got effectiveness along the horizontal scale. Hopefully no one is bottom left. Ideally we want everyone on the top right. Great set of values, and they're brilliant coaches and they get the best out of everyone. But life isn't like that. So think about top left and bottom right. Top left, great values but not the best coach, and bottom right, fantastic coach but not a nice personality. So but every sport has those. So CEO, chief executive, what are you doing to make the good guys more effective and the bad guys but great coaches nicer people? That's really important. And also for those people that perhaps the really good coaches, but they are risky characters because of the way they do it, you have to make a value judgment. Are you going to keep them in your program because of the culture that they bring and the statement that makes? We are content to have people like that in our organization. So I think you need to, chief executives need to think about what those people add or subtract to the culture from the organization.
Yeah, and Beatrice is raising some good points too about measurement. And this is a cultural artifact, right? How do we structure accountability so that people are being held to different measures? So far, I know in Canada, it's really been about performance outcomes, medals. That's how we're funded, rewarded. Can we expand that definition and measure of success to include the health and well-being of the athletes, the psychological safety across the environment, and therefore also the coaching practices that are being upheld, and then you got coaches who are like, oh my God, did I sign on for this? I'm a technical coach. I don't know about all these other psychological stuff. Is that fair to expect of coaches? What do people think?
We've introduced so we now have an annual cultural assessment of each program, where we every athlete, coach, practitioner, and stakeholders complete an online survey, which is anonymous, has about 20 questions, and from that we're able to use that to identify what things a program does well, and what areas that they need to work on, and we use that as a development activity, and where we are concerned about the outcomes, we will then send a team of experienced assessors to go in and what we call the walk the floor visit, and they will, in focus groups, that they will talk to athletes, male athletes, female athletes, young athletes, older athletes, coaches, practitioners, and the stakeholders to form as rounded opinion of the culture of that program, and then generate a culture development plan, which which we give back to the sport, and they have to produce an action plan to address it.
Love it. And all of these metrics, the evaluative criteria, are reflecting some core principles that I keep hearing in everything that you're saying around catching things early, around the athlete being at the center, or at least development being at the center of everything, the development of the coach, development of the athletes, development of society overall. Even the order of your communication, that example you gave of when you tell and who you tell the results of selection, that really embodied for me that this is about developing young people. And so, yes, these ones are cloud nine. These are the ones that are going to need some support and guidance into what their next steps are. So let's address that first. Love it. Other questions that are poking up here. One of them I wanted to not forget, and that was around independence. And you've mentioned this, bringing in the assessors, having that athletes commission rep. So these external or more objective, less biased, something that balances the power a little more. And people have comments about that, the importance of independence or how well it's working. We've just restructured our sport dispute resolution process and center, and to be a little more third party. And John talked about expanding, so it's not one individual running around too late to gritty situations, but actually burgeoning that out to 8 people and trying to catch it earlier. What else works? Or how important is that independence? Comments? Anybody?
I would say any method to capture that feedback. Any disclosure is good disclosure. If it's just being the conversations are happening in silos, in locker rooms, in hotel rooms, between athletes, then that's a dangerous place for the entire organization to be in. There isn't, that's not a place where things can be done. Hopefully those independent parties and those third party disclosures like that, in my opinion, is very far down the road as an intermediary piece. If the lines of communication are open between the administration, the coaching staff, and the players, in every way of those relationships, then the boat can stay afloat. I think when and then there is also the third party stuff, disclosures that can be flagged, that can be raised, that can be discussed. But once we're getting into an investigation scenario, like you have a hole in the lifeboat now. The ship isn't sailing anymore, and it's extremely costly, both on resources and on money and on performance. And it would be great, and it's an ideal place for cultures to be able to catch that early. And I think certain frameworks do need to be in place. Role clarity for me is one of them. What are the expectations of a coach? What are the expectations of a player? And to be able to have respect, and the administration, and to be able to have respect that we don't all have oversight on everybody's job, and that we won't always like a selection. We won't always like a decision that a player makes on the field, or a board member makes in the boardroom. But to understand that we're all in it together, and really truly to have the trust that everybody's moving in the right direction, and we're not throwing stones within our own administrations, calling out victims and villains. Thank you.
Beautiful, that canceling, right? Instead, remembering we're part of a bigger ecosystem. I mean, we've got some big cases that we're looking at right now, like the Blackhawks case, right? Where it's very interesting to see how the power dynamics are putting pressure on people to behave a certain way. Where's the fix? Is it about canceling certain individuals? Maybe, but also where else? Where else is the accountability and the responsibility, and what other levers or structures can we put in place to create a better environment where we do better? Beautifully said, Andrea. And I want to circle back to something John said earlier about no compromise, because I put that in my questions to him too. It's, I work with our NSO CEO is from Great Britain, and he'll talk about what the UK is doing often, because that's his home, right? So we're drawing on the learnings. But this no compromise phrase and how it got misinterpreted. So you explained it as, we're not going to compromise in terms of development and support for athletes. That's great, but it got misinterpreted, and now it's wrongly interpreted as all about the medals, you know, and top of the medal table. What are your strategies there? How do you think that happens? I mean, we've got exactly the same thing in Canada where it's on the podium, right? And the funding is all hinging on medals. We're working hard to expand the metrics, but people have grabbed hold of this, and now high performance is it can be interpreted as a bit of a dirty word. What are you doing to clarify the meaning, or, you know, help people see, as Andrew was saying, we're all in this together, get the values more explicit? What do you think, John?
So we've dumped the phrase. I mean, what was wrong? If you'd said no compromise on our values, and you had a really good set of values, then I think you would have had a really good mantra there. But UK sport has its values, but the high performance system doesn't have values. The reason being is because every program is embedded in an NSO, and therefore every NSO has its values. So as a result, we decided the easiest thing to do was to basically dump the phrase, and we replace it with what it takes to win. And what it takes to win has about 14 elements, and that, you know, facilities, medical science, athlete welfare, and so on and so forth. So that we have those 14 elements, and those constitute what it takes to win. And I think that was for us the big change. The other problem that we had, which I think, you know, it was a perfect storm, with no compromise, was we talked very much about medal targets, and the press love medal targets. It's really simple, and it was, and we played along with it. I suspect we probably discussed it with in the first place, but as a result, we built a hook, and the press put us on it, and we've really struggled to get off it. And so as a result, for Tokyo, we talked about a range of medals, and it was a pretty big range of medals. And we talk now normally about a top 5 finish, and that's simply on the basis that I think the UK is still the 5th biggest economy in the world. So realistically, we ought to be about 5th. And I think we would say anything between 7th and 3rd would be a good outcome for the games, because obviously there's little things like home advantages and et cetera. So we've tried to make the metrics a bit more forgiving, because that way then we get less media attention, which is a good thing.
Well, and I see Sam wanting to join in the conversation here. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is when we think of those like big metrics that we talk about, so whatever your podium performance is or what have you, when you think about that, it almost leads to the do whatever you have to do to get to that metric, versus when we diversify what our metrics are, break them down into the different places and spaces, we can actually do a check-in on going, is our system building towards the metrics we want to achieve? And when we look at different metrics, we know that we're then implementing the right pieces to achieve that top 5 finish that you're talking about, right? And I'll tie into another point, because I was looking at, I think it was Beatrice's comment here, how do we blend the two between safe sport and the expected outcome? And for me, it's actually quite simple, is you don't achieve the expected outcome until you have safe sport. And your system is not robust and good until you have safe sport, right? When we start putting those pieces in along the way and talking about those metrics, we're going to start to see these expected outcomes in a much more systematic way, instead of this like so-and-so country had a great 1 to 5 years, right? Now we're seeing who are the leaders in sustainable systems.
So I agree. And we don't fund sport just to get medals. We actually, when we invest in sport, we invest because it's got a sustainable pathway. They've got, they've got the coaches, they've got the athletes, etc. And it's a multi-cycle endeavor. So just because you might hit or indeed exceed your medal targets in old speak, at a games, is no guarantee of continuation of funding. We are funding our programs out at the minute as far as LA, and so that our investment horizon is 8 to 10 years, and the results in Tokyo have little bearing on that. They're a factor, but any one of our programs, it's what have they got in the tank for Paris and what have they got in the tank for LA. And in order to do that, you're right, you've got to have a safe system there that makes people want to come forward and partake. So
expanding that definition of success, including things like welfare, including safe environments, that's part of the package on the pathway to high performance. Wonderful. And I love the word sustainable. We love it at Railroads as well, because it will sustain itself, right? People will keep coming back. It's a pleasant place to be and they're learning. Thank you. And I'm also hearing this idea of lots of education, proactive induction. That's a great word for athletes, but also anybody coming into the sport environment. So they're oriented to the expectations. And then you're also talking about a kind of constant monitoring with your, the surveys, but also, people that are there keeping everyone accountable to those premises, those values. I wanted to ask Natasha, because we haven't heard from her yet, a little bit about her research. She's working in the sport of rugby, but around psychological safety. And what are you finding is helping create those kind of safe environments? What are crucial elements?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to jump in, John, and just say that that's amazing, moving away from funding based on medals and more as a sustainable environment and what the team has. As I am doing my research on psychological safety with the women's sevens team, a lot of what I'm finding is the athletes just want to feel safe to fail. They want to have a safe environment to be themselves. They want to be able to share and challenge and be in those hard conversations, but in a humanistic way. What I've been doing is going through Timothy Clark's 4 stages of psychological safety, which are inclusion, learner safety, contributor safety, and challenger safety. And what I've noticed is the challenges that are being experienced is this grooming that you explained, John, a bit of athletes having to act a certain way or do certain things to be successful with the environment, and just not feeling as if their voice is necessarily heard or listened to. They want to have an environment where all their feedback is welcome, not just to them, but to the organization. And one thing I think is important in what you're saying on the annual cultural assessment of a program is that the athletes have a safe platform to do that all the time, and that they will be protected by their organization and will not be compromised their position on their team.
Cool, wonderful. And again, these are structured, they're in place, they are artifacts of a culture that embodies these kinds of principles. And Tracy Blake is here with us. Thanks, good to see you here, Tracy, talking a bit about the organization. So we might have power balance within that coaching environment. Coach athlete are partners and they have people that are supporting them, and there's this balance because of expectation, clear criteria, clear metrics. But then we look at the organization that is to support them, and sometimes there's power imbalances there. And so maybe, and as Tracy was saying, we're not all in the same boat, or we're working at odds to each other, or there are some that are leveraging power over. I was reflecting on the Blackhawks case, and Kyle Beach was right. That coach did have power over him, and he was afraid to say anything or do anything. And he was in a very, very vulnerable position, as were many of his teammates. How do we structure that out of sport and out of the sport organization as a whole, or system as a whole? Ideas on that?
I'm going to be quite controversial. I think power imbalance is inherent in sport. I don't think you can get away from it. It's a reality of sport, and therefore you need to put in place structures and processes that minimize the effect on that and give people, give particular athletes a voice when something is not right.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, isn't it? Because you think, there are always going to be stronger athletes out there as well. And we don't necessarily want to, what do we mean by evening out the playing field? It isn't that we want everyone to be the same, because then it wouldn't be a game. We'd always have a draw. But how do we minimize the unfairness, perhaps, of those power imbalances? Okay, so what are some of the structures that are working organizationally in the UK to minimize the effect of power imbalance?
So we, I think there's two that are in play and one that we're working on now. So first of all is making the British Athletes Commission independent and a credible organisation, so that when they turn up to support the athlete feels that the balance is well, not in their favour, but the system is balanced as much as it can do. Secondly, we said that whenever there's dispute between athletes and coaches, or an athlete and its NSO, that there has to be an independent investigation and an independent finding of fact through either a discipline or grievance panel with independent members, and there has to be an independent appeal, and for any selection decisions there has to be an independent appeal. Now, I'm not sure about the status of employment law in Canada, but in the UK, that would be seen as very much gold star plus in terms of employment law, noting that athletes aren't employees, but most employees would be expected to conduct their own internal investigations, etc. We felt that because of the contested nature of sport, because the athletes and the coaches are funded with public money, there's a public interest, that we felt that we wanted to go for the gold standard of independence in those elements to provide better safeguards.
We're wrestling with that as well, right? And we have a new universal code of conduct that addresses maltreatment across sport. And it's interesting when you raise the word grooming immediately. I was so thankful for that, because in our UCCMS, that universal code, grooming is only talked about in a sexual context. It isn't talked about in terms of the relationships and the emotional kind of phenomena or situation you described, John. So it's nice to hear you highlight that. I think we need to take it another step. And I'm also hearing that we need to go back to, Athletes Can and our athletes commissions and talk about the roles that they play in.
And when you're talking about grooming, you need to include parents and carers and support network, because these individuals can be very, very clever, very clever at how they do it. And you're right, it's not always sexual. Sometimes it can be for other reasons. It can be for financial, and that financial is linked to performance, because obviously the better performance, the better the tangential benefits, and so on and so forth. Therefore, a coach associated with a high value, high net worth athlete, there are obvious benefits to that. So it's you need to have an active radar.
Absolutely. And that folds into the education to be able to recognize it, but also prevent it. So many good, and we have to come at these challenges from so many different angles, don't we? All right. Other comments that we have from the participants. Any other questions? I didn't want to lose sight of something at the back there, but other comments from Andrea. Do you want to share what you're hoping to delve into with your research? Just put you on the spot there.
Yeah, thank you. No, trying to hit the mute button. It's what's really interesting to me is what is going on in the brain when we're under stressful environments for an extended period of time. So not just the athletes, but also the coaches, because as our cognitive and mental health declines, our ability to see a positive, shiny, hopeful future declines as well. And we tend to lash out, and we tend to be short, and we tend to take things personally, and tend to be more affected by things when we are not in a good mental state. So what I'm actually really curious about beyond the culture is like physiologically what is happening in our brain on the mental health side, not just around thoughts and behaviors, but that might be how it is manifested. That might be what we are recognizing. But if our brains are on overload as athletes and as coaches, and we're under stress for a long time, and you start to see it kind of, later on in athletes' lives, like all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, they're old and they start declining. And I don't know if I buy into that. I think at some point the body's operating in some sort of dependence or some sort of depletion of certain necessary vitamins and minerals. And that makes it harder to recover, harder to think clearly, harder to take things on the chin, as it were. But then also, I don't think that, like, when if a coach is like yelling at some, like just outwardly yelling at somebody, that is not a natural human reaction. We do it. We lose our temper sometimes. But I think there's more to it. So that's what I'm interested right now. And I think, John, you had a comment.
Yeah. Well, Tom's finding the mute. That reminds me of the word contested, right? That we're in this environment that's all about contest and competing, and it's intense. So how do we manage that? How do we experience that in a way that's not also incredibly destructive? Because it feels like we're on that destructive end of the spectrum rather than on the thriving, challenging, in the face of adversity, growing end. What are some ways that you're addressing that in the UK, or what are some comments people have about that?
I'll jump in. I think that there's obviously the places and spaces where sport is competitive and intense, and whether that's even the places and spaces in your daily training environment where that shows up, or just like in general in competition. But most of the time, our spaces are quite collaborative, right? And they are about just working on those like growth pieces. And so it's reframing that. And I sometimes think that people like to stress how competitive and intense it is. And it's like, we get it, it is. But we can also do a lot of work in those collaborative, like growth-minded, resilient spaces. And when you take away the fact that it's always so competitive and intense all the time, it forces coaches to go like, I'm not that needed or necessary in this space. What am I actually working on to like create a strong, robust development space? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Development. Any comments on that, John, from the UK? What's your perspective?
I think shouting really gets the job done, and I think that there's a time and a place, and I think the more enlightened coaches know when to, and perhaps some of the less good and less enlightened coaches need a bit of guidance in this. But I think, look, we've been talking an awful lot about negative behaviours, and I think it's important that we remember that actually there are awful lot of really good coaches out there that treat athletes well, that don't shout and scream, that aren't on the grooming list, etc. So, we are talking about, I think, a small group. One of the things that strikes me about coaching is most coaches are former athletes, therefore their coaching style will be influenced by how they were coached. And I think there's a need to break that chain, because the speed of societal change outpaces the speed of coaching, education and development. And I think it's really important that when someone comes into coaching, that their immediate reaction is not to do it how it was done to them, but to think very carefully about the right techniques and procedures that work with the current cohort of athletes who will be a generation younger than them, who will have very different expectations. You know, I look at all of you, you've all got after your name brackets, she, hers, his, you know, etc. You know, that's something that's changed in the last couple of years. You know, societal norms and standards are moving at a very fast rate. And I think it's important that we equip our coaches to deal with the challenges that they face, not the challenges that were foisted upon them 10 and 15 years ago.
Wonderful to hear that. It's harkening back to the conversation I had this morning as well, you know, and how intergenerationally and the changes we're experiencing. Isn't sport a great environment for learning these kinds of things? And wonderful to hear, yeah, we do need to rally around athletes, but also coaches. I didn't want to lose sight of Brent Hall's comment about the independence of the athlete and being able to make choices. We'll come back to that in a moment because Natasha had her mic off and I think had some.
Oh, I was just going to make a comment, even just like how coaches' practices have totally changed over generations. And what was acceptable way back then is no longer acceptable. And I find that's a bit of what I'm navigating in my research, and even like being in relationship with your athletes is like the best thing that can happen. Like John, you had said that yelling gets things done. I think that's what you said, if I quoted you wrong, sorry.
Sorry, yelling doesn't get things done.
Oh, does it? Okay, good. I was like, there it is. But I totally agree with that. And like, if your coach is going to yell, I hope they're in relationship and you understand maybe that's not what they're intending by it. But yeah, I don't know where I was going with that thought, but very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And the idea of trauma being, you know, we're confronting that. There has been a lot of harm. The style of coaching and the acceptable norms in sport have been quite violent and harmful, as and excused as part of the intensity. And now we're learning, well, we maybe don't need to actually harm. You can tackle someone without an intent to actually be violent and harm them and hurt them, break their leg or something, right? That actually goes against, it's not very sensible for sport, because we need our competitors. But trauma, but we need to also embrace the fact that, yeah, people have been traumatized, and what John was suggesting, that coaches have come from a different era, and or as athletes, we've been raised in a different era, and we have these expectations, just like we're doing with so many other aspects of our social interactions, right? Learning to be a little more conscious, and that's hard because we're always afraid of doing something a little wrong or offending people. I had a few other questions that I didn't want to miss. We got about 15 minutes left here, and there's some big topics like gender, like women. In Canada, the bulk of our medals, I actually counted it up, and it's over 70 athletes were female that won medals for Canada compared to 8 men. And yet women are still fighting for equity in sport in Canada. It's coming, but there's still a real inequity on the field, in the organizations. What's going on in the UK in that realm, in that area?
So I think I'm right in saying that the teams that we took to Tokyo were more female than male athletes the first time. I think female sport, women's sport has come on leaps and bounds over the last 2 cycles. Has it got parity? God, that's a tricky one. I mean, I'd like to say I think it has, but inevitably the general public look at sport through a particular lens, and I think that's got to, you know, I mean, you know, you go and look at. So I like rugby. I go and watch a men's game. You go and see a women's game, and the stands are empty. One of my colleagues at UK Sport, she's a passionate Arsenal fan, and I've asked her, did she go and watch the Arsenal ladies play? Which she went, no, I'd rush rather go and watch the men play. They play a better game. So, you know, how do you overcome sort of views like that? So that's why I say I still think, for all the opportunities that we put out there, there is the broader public perception and media perception that still has a bit of work to go. In terms of sport administration, if anything, I think men are becoming an endangered species. We've got a lot of very good female CEOs. Most, I think, 5 of the 6 executives in UK sport are female. Our chair's female. So it's, I certainly think it's on the up.
Good to hear. Great to hear. And I think we're still wrestling with it, but it's coming. Are there comments from the participants or our panelists about processes, structures that can support the advancement of women in sport leadership positions, as well as in the field of play?
Well, I hear you there, John. Like, what Rugby Canada has done with their governance is they've written it into the bylaws that there cannot be more than, I think it's 40% of any one gender, right? Because they're forecasting years down the road, because I believe we need diversity, right? We need to have representations from all sorts of groups that we're representing, right? So we can get a better, more holistic perspective. And so when Rugby Canada was rewriting their bylaws, it wasn't about getting a 50-50 women, female male board, because I hear you on what you're saying. Like I feel for white men some days, right? Like it feels like it's a tough time to be a white man in sport, or in business, because they're getting a lot of fingers pointed at them, right? And I think often they're not being recognized for the good work that they are doing, right? Like, I've had many white men who have supported me wholeheartedly through my career, so there's no way I can say that, oh, these white old boys are, oh, they're trouble. Like, absolutely not. That doesn't land for me whatsoever, and it doesn't reflect the values that I have when it comes to inclusivity in sport. But so yeah, because seriously, the trajectory would be, if we continue, could be that all of a sudden we have 100% female representation, and then the issues that we're seeing on the women's side of the game of rugby, for example, I can speak to that, might be just cropping up on the men's side, right? So rather than swinging the pendulum so far to the left, so far to the right, then finding the middle ground, how do we incrementally shift it so we actually find where we want to be?
Actually, I wouldn't mind being an endangered species. I think there might be a few up arrows. No, I mean, look, no, you're right, and I think look, was it Barack Obama said that change is not a straight line. You get some ups and downs, but ultimately the arc takes you in the right direction, and I think it will go in the right direction. I don't think there'll be a massive overcorrection in favour of women, but inevitably I think there'll be a few sort of lumps along the way. I tell you one area where actually I don't think we do particularly well, and I'm disappointed. I think last month it was the first time that a female referee took charge of a Premier League football game. Why? You don't need to have an outstanding physical strength to be a referee. So I'm disappointed at the number of women referees in football, rugby, cricket. Why aren't women driving Formula One cars? Because they do all right on horses. So yeah, I agree with everything you say.
And thank you, Andrea, and really drilling it down to the principles that we're talking about, which is really what we're fighting for, not so much 50-50, but this idea of diversity, because it makes sense. It's actually really valuable, and equity and fairness and accessibility for all. And there are a number of people in the chat also referencing para, and I'd love to hear more about para in the UK and comments about para. But that para has been, we did a webinar on it earlier, a couple actually, and how it's really a wonderful environment that is challenging our thinking and reminding us of what sport's really for. I also wanted to highlight, and I mentioned Brent Hall made a great comment earlier about the independence of an athlete, making decisions for themselves in relation to their health and their mental health or physical health. And sometimes, they need support there too, because they don't always make the right decisions. And so always being in partnership, hey? It's yet another area of education for all of us, the parents, athletes, everyone who's playing a role within the sport environment as stakeholders. It puts a lot on us, but I really think sport is so important and valuable that it is worth investing all of this to make sure everyone's equipped for a really great experience in sport. What is the value of sport? What is the value of sport? You know, we have this medal table sometimes. I think the media has got a big role. We should maybe try and get there too and talk about that a little more. But why sport? Why is it important? Comments from anyone? Andrea.
I want to answer Paula McQuaid's comment. The only way to change the narrative is for these men to advocate for those of us who do not have the same privilege. I want to go back to, I was sitting on a board where we were hiring, and the conversation, and the question that I asked for the first half of the applicants was, what do you see, what do you see the role of women's rugby in the organization moving forward? And then after a few applicants, I stopped asking it because I just felt like, I cannot be the token female advocating for and asking for women's rugby. It needs to be, that narrative for it to truly be owned by an organization. It needs to be brought up by multiple people around, who are having those conversations. And sure enough, there was a couple other men who were on the hiring panel that actually started asking the question. For me, that was a win, right? Because for me, it did show that the walk was matching the talk.
Love it. Other comments? Awesome. You got an awesome from Paul.
Yeah, and going to your question there, Jen, I think, what is sport? I think sport is a vehicle for an expression of human spirit. That's what gets us up on our feet spontaneously, gives us goosebumps, has us hugging strangers on sidewalks after catching a video, like a replay that's being shown on a TV screen on the road. Like, it's just absolutely incredible how it bridges. And I think because it can be so near and dear to our heart that we really want to protect it and push it at all costs, right? Because I think it just touches and taps into such a deep part of ourselves. Thank you.
So many great stories out of Tokyo. Hey, got a hand up from Mike. Go ahead, Mike. I'm not going to attempt your last name. You can turn your mic on. Mike? Maybe not. It might be that Amara has to. You can poke your question in the chat as well if you can't unmute. That's great. And Brian, why sport? Because sport is the power to bring people together like nothing else. Nelson Mandela. That said, to manage the expectations, sport can be part of the solution, but not the solution to societal ills. Not the total solution. Yeah, it's an avenue, right, for learning. Yeah. I think too, if you've had a very positive experience through sport, you become a real advocate for it and fight hard. I feel sad for those who've had those terrible experiences and maybe are so disappointed. I'd like to reduce that number for sure. We have these medal tables in the media, and that seems to indicate, how valuable sport is to a country. And I've always been really confused by the medal table because I think, what do medals even bring to a country other than some pride, of course, and the athletes feel great because they've succeeded at something they've aspired to, but it doesn't really, I don't know what else it represents. It seems like a strange thing to grab onto, but maybe just because it's easy. What else could we ask our media to promote about the value of sport, or what role do you think the media could play so that they don't get it wrong like they did in the UK around no compromise? Yeah. Natasha.
Personally, just thinking even of my own experience and coming out of a medal in Rio, and I never associate my experience with winning. I got to see parts of the world I got to develop as a human, discover my values, what's important, what's not important, also who I am as an athlete. And when people are associating medals with success, I struggle. I feel like it should be the person. Like, what has that person accomplished? What are they able to accomplish throughout their sport career? Like what John was saying, like education, what are you doing for your professional? And I thought it was really cool while I was watching Tokyo, they mentioned what one of the athletes was going to get up to post Tokyo. And I was like, yeah, that's, it shouldn't be about win or lose. It should be, they're going to develop and continue their professional career after this. Because when sport's over, even for me, it was hard to grasp who am I without sport? What am I doing? And actually, I put my energy into my project because I knew there were gaps in sport. I'll pass it on to.
Yeah, go for it. How about Samantha?
Yeah, I've always viewed sport as a medium in which people express their values. And then I look at the spaces that I work in the parasport space, and I watch, and I said this on a previous webinar as well, but athletes work on disability. I watch them work on doing their education while doing sport at the same time. I watch them be leaders in their community. And basically, sport is a really good place for them to practice these skills and to work on their competitive sport-specific skills, but also work on these other pieces that is going to roll forward for them in whatever their next stage is. And so my hope is that sport will always have a place in their life. But it is really that medium in which people express themselves, work on their important life skills, and have that safe space to kind of play, right?
And, with others from other countries, like we're doing today, right? Learning from each other, and love that Win. And Win is another alumni and has graduated with her doctorate recently from Royal Roads, and worked on flow, teaching flow with kids. Love it. And, the media did really was influenced by the athlete voices, who are also grabbing onto media channels that they have at their fingertips. And I found, that like Wynn said, they started to promote personal bests. It wasn't always about the medal and who the top three. In rowing, a lot of races in rowing, you win one medal. That's it. There's no silver and bronze. I kind of like that. Reduces the focus even more, and you really have to reconcile yourself with a fourth and a third, and it's good. Other comments from, how about Andrea? We haven't heard from you. Final words, or John, about the value of sport.
Oh gosh, I'm not sure I can add anything else. I mean, it's the emotion, it's the passion, it's everything, isn't it? I mean, why do people, what motivates people to play it, to follow it? I think it's one of those, it can be truly inspirational. And I also agree with the comment that someone said about you can't use sport to cure society of all its ills. I agree with that, but I do think we all have obligations to set good standards of conduct and hold people to it, because we do inspire.
We do. It's the most engaging human endeavor is sport. We have the stats. We know how many people watch the Olympics, how many people tune in to sport. And so we're participating in so many different ways in this sector that it does have a lot of power to influence. So thank you. I'll leave those. Any last words? Andrea, you got last words?
I was just thinking, nobody gives you anything in sport. And that is, I think, what is really respected. And that's what people tune in for, right? From the athletes, they have this whole journey, this whole story that they've been striving for. And perhaps it is a medal. Like, we do want to do our best. Wouldn't it be great if that had a shiny little medal at the end of it too, right? And I think people tune in to really honor and to watch and to follow along with that drama of human striving. And at the end of the day, we might be disappointed that it's not a medal, but you know what? The ride that we went on, following it on, biting our nails, up on our feet, that's something that I always have to thank the athletes for, because they put on such a great show.
It is wonderful. Thank you. I'm just going to quickly put up the final slide because it has some contact information as well. There we go. So if you'd like to follow up, and Sam put her email in the chat, but if people would like to reach out, I'm all about creating communities of learning. And so keep the conversation going. Some fabulous people attending today. So it would be lovely to keep talking about this, but I want to give a special thank you to our panelists today, John Donnelly, Natasha Watcham-Roy, Samantha Heron, and Andrea Burke. I personally learned a lot talking to someone from another country, wrestling with very similar challenges to those that we're wrestling with here in Canada, but using different language, exploring it from different angles is going to help us. So I hope we can stay connected.